Hi everyone, and welcome back to another session of me reading The Hobbit by JRR Tolkien. We are in chapter 9 now, and we are officially halfway through the book. Now I know that seems a little bit scary, considering how many days and sessions it's taken us to get here, but the rest of the book is actually quite short. Chapter 9, I'm going to split into two parts, but it's actually not a super long chapter. It's just a little bit too long for me to try to film it in a 30-minute segment. And then chapter 12 is almost 20 pages long. So that one I'm going to divide into two. But all the rest of the chapters up till the end of the book are actually only between about 6 and 8 pages. So I should be able to get all of them done in one session. So this will be one of our last two-parters, and I'll post this today. I'll post the next one in just a couple days, so I'm not leaving you guys hanging too much, but we'll finish it up this week. So, if you guys remember last time, our party was in Mirkwood, and they got a little confused. They got a little lost. Bilbo was able to save all of the dwarves from the spiders, and in the process, Thorin actually got taken by the elves who live in Mirkwood. So he's currently in their dungeon, and we don't really know what's going on with Bilbo and the rest of the company. So today's session, we are going to find out what happens there. So I'm going to get started. Chapter 9 is called Barrels Out of Bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out of the forest before they died of thirst and hunger. So as you guys remember, they haven't had food in a long time, and they're currently out, and all of their baggage was taken, and there's really no hope. They're really just going to do a last stand here. They got up and staggered in the direction in which the 8 out of the 13 of them guessed to be the right one in which the path lay. But they never found out if it was right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into the blackness of night, when suddenly out sprang of the lights of many torches around them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leapt the wood elves, with their bows and their spears, and called the dwarves to halt. There was no such thought of a fight. Even if the dwarves had not been in such a state as they were actually glad to be captured with their small knives, and the only weapons that they had would have been no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, and counted them, they never found the Hobbit. So, Bilbo's still being a little tricksy. He's trying to figure out if, even though this is like, oh man, we really need to not get captured, they're really trying to figure out a way to, he's really just trying to find a way to help. And it's been helping him in most instances. He's been the one that's been saving them, all due to this magic ring. Nor did they hear him or feel him trotting along well behind their torchlights as they led off their prisoners to the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded. That did not make much difference, though, for even Bilbo, with the use of his eyes, could not see where they were going, and neither he nor the others knew where they had started from anywhere. Bilbo had all he could to keep up with the torches, for the elves were making the dwarves go fast as they ever could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the Hobbit had just the time to catch up with them before they ran across the bridge. This was the bridge that led across to a river to the king's door. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cave that ran to the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There the great beaches came right down to the bank until their feet were in the stream. Across the bridge, the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated at the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over at the heels of the last elves, before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a great clang. Inside, the passages were lit with red torches, and the elf guards sang as they marched on the twisting and crossing and echoing paths. These were not like the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with clean air. In the great hall, pillars hewn out of the living stone, sat the elven king on a chair of carved wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was to come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers, and in his hand he held a carved staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes here, he said. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who have once been brought inside. Long and searching, he questioned the dwarves about their doings and what they were going to and where they were coming from. But he got little more news out of them than of Thorin. They were surly and angry and did not even want to pretend to be polite. What have we done, O king? Said Balin, who was the eldest left. Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry, to be thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beast or your pets? Does killing them make you angry? Such a question, of course, made the king angrier even still. And he answered, Is it a crime to wander in my realm without leave? Do you forget that you are in my kingdom using the road my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here. And if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until you have learned your sense and manners. He then ordered the dwarves each to be put in a separate cell and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons until at least one of them was willing to tell him what he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also a prisoner. It was Bilbo who found that out. Now I'm going to pause just for a second because I have this picture in the book and it's called The Elven King's Gate. So this is a picture, kind of what they would seen going into Mirkwood, the kingdom of Mirkwood, of the wood elves, the Sylvan elves. So that's kind of a pretty picture to kind of see how it looks. A lot less dark and murky than the rest of Mirkwood has been for them. Poor Mr. Baggins. It was a weary, long time that he lived in this place all alone, and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remote corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elven King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the wood elves, sometimes with their king on the head, would from time to time ride out to hunt, or to do other business in the woods, or to lands of the east. If then Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he was nearly caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed. Yet he did not dare to march among them because of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly it was in the torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, it was not very often. He did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and indeed he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he discovered ways out of the woods and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself until a chance came to return. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter. But inside the caves, he was able to pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from the stores or the table when nobody was at hand. I am like a burglar that can't get away, and I must go on miserably burglaring at the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and dullest part of this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by my own warm fireside with the lamp shining. Now, I haven't kept count, but if any of you guys have kept count how often Bilbo wished that he was in his hobbit hole, sitting by the fire or drinking tea or having breakfast, I would love to hear, because I feel like it's at least 5 or 6 times at this point. He really wants to go home. He is not an adventurer. Eventually, after a week or so of his sneaking life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all 12 of their cells in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way very well. What was his surprise one day is to overhear some of the guards talking to, and learn too, that there was another dwarf in the prison as well, a specially deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that was Thorin, and after a while he found that his guesses were right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place where no one was about, and to have a word with the chief of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was even thinking of telling the king all about his treasure and quest, which shows how low-spirited he really had become. Then he heard Bilbo's little voice at the keyhole. He could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and came to the door and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each of the imprisoned dwarves, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also in prison close at hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, nor before Thorin gave his word. For Thorin had taken heart against hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share in treasure until all hope of escaping in any other way had disappeared. In fact, that remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of whom he had come to have a very high opinion of indeed, had altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarfs quite agreed when they got the message. They had all thought that their own shares in the treasure, which they quite regarded as theirs, in spite of their plight and still unconquered dragon, would suffer seriously if the wood elves claimed any part of it. They all trusted Bilbo. Just what Gandalf had said would happen, you see. Perhaps this was part of his reason for going off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so hopeful as they did, for he did not like to be depended on by everyone, and wished he had had the wizard at hand. But it was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood that lay between them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst, but no bright idea would come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it did not do well among the 14. But of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue his friends in the end, and this is how it happened. One day, while nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed under part of the lowest region of the palace and joined the forest river, some way further to the east, beyond the steep slope out of which the main mouth opened. Where this underground watercourse came forth from the hillside, there was a water gate. There the rocky roof came down to the surface of the stream, and from a portcullis could be dropped down to the bed of the river to prevent anyone coming in or out that way. But the portcullis was often open, for a good deal of traffic went out by the water gate. If anyone had come that way, he would have found himself in a dark, rough tunnel leading deep to the heart of the hill. But at one point, where it passed under caves of the roof, had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These trapdoors went upward to the king's cellar, where barrels and barrels and barrels stood. For the wood elves, and especially for their king, who was fond of wine, there were no vines that grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought from them far away, from their kinsfolk in the south, or the vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of these largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trapdoors and their use, and lurking there, listening to the talk of the king's servants, he learned about the wine and the other goods that came up the river, or overland, to the long lake. It seemed like a town of men still throve there, built on bridges far to the water as protection against enemies of all sorts, especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought to the forest river. Often they were tied together like big rafts and pulled and rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded onto flat boats. When the barrels were empty and the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened the water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbing along until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river where the bank jutted out, near the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back towards Lake Town, which stood to the close point of where the forest river flowed into the long lake. So this is a little bit of a description of where the barrels would have gone, but I'm going to try to show you here on the map. So we are at Mirkwood Forest right here. That's this whole area. If you look right here, there is the Elven King's Hall, and there is the river that goes down to the Long Lake. Now the Long Lake, at the Long Lake right there, there's actually a town, they call it Lake Town. And if any of you've seen the movie, you know that that's the closest city to the Lonely Mountain besides the city of Dale, which is currently unoccupied. So what happened is that Smaug came in to the Lonely Mountain and burned the town of Dale, which was a settlement of men right in front of the Lonely Mountain. So there's the Lonely Mountain, there's the town of Dale, and then a lot of the people, if any of them escaped from Dale, they went to Lake Town. So Lake Town is kind of a area of men that they get food and goods to and from this river. So I'm going to continue. We've only got a little bit longer. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about the water gate, wondering if it could be used for the escape of his friends. And at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had just been taken to the prisoners. The guards were trampling away down the passages, taking torchlight with them, and leaving everything in the darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief and the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be hard at work tonight clearing the cellars of empty wood, so let us have a drink first to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste it with you, and if it's a good fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and I would not want to send the poor stuff up." Okay, I've got about another page or so. So this is going to be the start of this, and then I'm gonna end it, and then we'll pick up on the next area the next time we have our session. When he heard this, Bilbo was all aflutter, for he saw that with that luck was with him, and that he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down at a table on which 2 large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy, but this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardeners of Dorwinnon, not meant for soldiers or servants, but for the king's feasts only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head, laid it on the table, and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice, but soon his head too nodded on the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passages towards the cells. The great bunch seemed very heavy in his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth, despite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making noise every now and then, a loud clink clank, which put him all a tremble. First he unlocked Balin's door. It locked again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad that he could get out of his wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions, and know what Bilbo was going to do, and all about it. "No time," said the Hobbit. "You just follow me. We must keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape now or none. This is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, and with chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue. That's a good fellow." Then he went off from door to door until his following had grown to 12, none of them too nimble, with the dark and what with their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time of them bumped into another, or grunted or whispered in the dark. "Drat this dwarvish racket," he said to himself. But all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the wood that night, and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were at merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon, far off in a deep place, and fortunately not too far from the cellars. "Upon my word," said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends, "Gandalf spoke true as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the time comes. I am sure we are all ever in your service, whatever happens after this. What comes next?" Bilbo saw the time had come to explain his idea as far as he could, but he did not feel all sure about how the dwarves would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it one bit, and they started grumbling loud in spite of their danger. "We shall be too bruised and battered to pieces and drowned for sure, certainly," they muttered. "We thought you had gotten some sensible notion, that you managed to get a hold of keys. This is a mad idea." "Very well," said Bilbo, downcast and rather annoyed. "Come back along to your nice cells and I'll lock you back in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I'll ever get a hold of keys again, if I feel inclined to try." This was too much for them. They calmed down, and in the end, of course, they had to do what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find a way out in the upper halls, or to fight their way out of gates that closed by magic. It was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So following the Hobbit down to the lowest cellars, they crept. They passed a door through which the chief guard and the butler could be seen happily snoring with smiles on their faces. The wine of Dorwinion brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard the next day, even though Bilbo, before they went, stole in and kind-heartedly put his keys back on his belt. "That will save him the trouble he is in for so far," said Mr. Baggins to himself. He wasn't a bad fellow, quite decent to the prisoners. It will puzzle all of them, too. They will think we had a very strong magic to pass through all these locked doors and disappear. Disappear! We've got to get very busy very quick if that's to happen. So that's going to be kind of an interesting tale. You're going to have the guards that fell asleep, and all of a sudden, all of the prisoners are gone, but the keys are still there. So what's going to happen in the next section? I cannot wait to see. I hope you guys tune in to see. Thank you so much. Bye.